Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were just able to take a few minutes break there. It can be a long time sitting at the desk looking at screen content. So I hope you're able to just perhaps look at the beauty of the outdoors and have a cup of coffee. I'm really delighted now to welcome our third speaker, Maddy Desforges, who has recently become Chief Executive of NAVCA. NAVCA is the national membership organisation representing local infrastructure organisations. Hi, Maddy, I can see you now on screen. Great to actually see you. NAVCA, as I say, is a membership organisation representing local infrastructure organisations that in turn support local voluntary action. And in fact, I'm not the only member of the CVSL team that has worked for organisations within the NAVCA network. So many of us at CVSL really been really involved in infrastructure organisations, and delighted to have you with us, Maddy. We're particularly grateful to Maddy for making time for us because she's so new to the role, and delighted to be amongst the first to have the opportunity to hear from her in this new role. And we know that she's going to speak about the importance of infrastructure organisations, and that she is going to advocate in this role for infrastructure, and particularly at this point of rebuilding resilient communities as we all emerge from lockdown. Until recently, Maddy was CEO of Voluntary Action Sheffield, a member organisation in the NAVCA network, and before that held a number of posts in the civil service. Maddy, thank you so much for joining us. We really look forward to hearing from you. And then Dr Daniel Haslam, one of my colleagues, will reflect from CVSL. Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol. And first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I feel somewhat daunted in the presence of academics because my experience is by doing rather than in the academic field. But I hope that what I've got to say will be useful and informative in some of the thinking about how we go forward. I think the first thing to say is about the importance of good leadership, and that's so imperative now, and times are indeed precarious. So this feels like a good time to talk about leadership in precarious times. So I'm going to talk about the leadership challenges that I've faced, specifically the leadership challenges over the last 12 months arising from the COVID pandemic. That means I'm going to talk a lot about Voluntary Action Sheffield under local, but I'll try to bring that back into some of my experiences over the last few weeks at national level. The experiences are all mine, but I know from talking to other people leading small community organisations, especially people beyond Sheffield and national organisations, as I have been over the last few weeks, that my experiences have played out many times all over the country. So what I'm talking about, I know can be extrapolated. Like Emil, I feel really privileged to have had the opportunities and experiences that I've had, even over these last 12 months. There's something special about being in a small voluntary sector organisation and how that sits within a much bigger system, which I think is one of the biggest challenges that we need to come back to. I'm not going to use slides. I think it's probably enough with me talking and the chat, just try to keep track of. So I'll just talk and then come back at the end. We got the opportunity to have some questions. So I thought it'd be useful to start by telling you a little bit about me. I think that context is really important. So how I am as a leader, my perspectives on leadership, and again, coming back to the focus for today. So as Carol said, I spent 5 years as Chief Executive at Voluntary Action Sheffield. Many of you will be familiar with CVS's local infrastructure. We focused on bringing organisations together, creating space for collaboration and partnership, providing support for small organisations, as well as being a conduit into some of the wider city structures. And that's the interface, which I think is really interesting in that role. So having a seat on the City Partnership Board, the Health and Wellbeing Board, the Accountable Care Partnership, and bringing in the voice of communities and the wealth of intelligence and information from the voluntary sector to the table to inform and influence those bigger systems. At VAS, we also had practical services for the volunteer centre, with a city centre building with conferences and meeting rooms. And we often filled the gaps where other people weren't operating. So, for example, coordinating support for refugees and asylum seekers. Before that, I spent 20 years as a civil servant in Whitehall, had a range of jobs as civil servants do, but with a thread around equality and promoting fair opportunity running through them. So I worked on the NEET strategy, child poverty, skills training for unemployed people, and most lastly on higher education around fair access to universities. So I think it's fairly safe to say that I'm kind of gamekeeper turned poacher in some regard, and I've shifted massively in my approach from wanting to write policy and strategy which keeps control centrally, to being a firm believer in the importance of local, of listening to and learning from local communities, and of the importance of system-wide leadership. So using different sectors, working closely together, and using the assets and the experience of each for the greater good and the greatest impact. And then, as I say, since the middle of March this year, I've been Chief Executive at NAVCA. We're an organisation with local focus, national voice, kind of bringing together of those two worlds, those two different bits in my career. And so we support local voluntary sector organisations with practical support and voice and influence at national level. And that feels more important now than ever, that bringing together of two different perspectives and aspects, local and national, and bringing the community voice into strategy and policy to give a much broader perspective. And over the last couple of months, I've experienced the leadership challenges that small communities face from that national view. So this morning, I've got a few reflections on precarious times, leadership and the importance of local, and then how those things connect, which I believe is in systems. So individual organisations or sectors can achieve a great deal, but we can achieve so much more if we work at systems level, recognising and developing the strengths of each bit of the system, and importantly, nurturing connections to make the most impact. As I say, I'll talk very much about the last 12 months, and many of you I know have been living and breathing the same thing. So apologies if I'm telling you things that you've all been doing for the last 12 months, but I think it's worth reflecting on that and thinking about the impact. So I'll start off with the precarious and the local. And we've seen through the pandemic that the first, and I would say best, people to respond to crisis are those at local level. So it was communities themselves that first rallied round back last March, it feels so long ago now, to make sure people had food and essential supplies, that they had medicines as lockdown was imposed. And we saw mutual aid groups spring up, existing community groups and local charities reconfiguring what they're doing. And there's something really important about the absorbing of additional needs, which all of those groups and communities did, to support people who are most isolated and to meet needs that are being manifested from people who up until now had been coping with life, but the additional pressures just proved too much. And that absorbing capacity of the sector is really important. But they also adapted really quickly. Firstly, excuse me, to be working remotely and online in line with restrictions, and then they reconfigured. So they went from providing that essential supplies to supporting people who are isolated and struggling, virtual cups of tea, waving through the window, Zoom Zumba classes, social cafes online. Communities led communications locally, helping make sure that people understood and complied with restrictions and changes to restrictions and changes again, and that they were using more relevant language and tools to connect to people locally. It was local communities that helped land the first community testing sites in the face of suspicion and concern. And it's they who've been working to ensure a smooth vaccination process, again, particularly working with people who might have been hesitant to try to increase take-up. And they were doing all that in the face of uncertainty. So uncertainty about restrictions, about what was allowed. And there was much greater clarity, it seemed to me, around pubs and other businesses than community centres, for example. Uncertainty about funding. Donations and commercial income were decimated and organisations were calling on their reserves to survive. Pro bono economics, they did a COVID charity track through the pandemic, and 30% of charities in this January said they were saying an increase in demand for services they wouldn't have the capacity to meet, and they were expecting further increases in demand. It's worth just pausing on that, because it takes an awful lot for a local community charity to say, we've seen an increase in demand for services that we haven't got the capacity to meet. That sense of turning people away, I don't think is in the DNA of community organisations. So there's been an awful lot going on, a lot happening, a lot of demands from all of that on leadership. But the other thing that for me, I think, is very personal. So for me, I think the last 12 months have been the hardest and the most testing 12 months of my career. And particularly it's about that colliding of stress in each aspect of my life, which particularly took its toll. And I'm sure that many people can relate to that. So stress at work, we were supporting organisations doing such critical work in a new environment with ongoing financial uncertainty. That was probably enough. We were working in a space where we really didn't know what was right and wrong, what would have greatest impact, whilst feeling the imperative of getting it right. But that was coupled with stress at home. For me, my husband got COVID quite early on, was hospitalised, had to have oxygen support, which was just a really incredibly scary time. My kids were at home, they had no structure, but they got onto online learning later, but those first few months there was nothing from school. And that sense of feeling isolated from friends and routine was really hard. And then there's also stress in the wider community and society as we all struggle with restrictions, with living our lives, riding that COVID roller coaster, watching the news or choosing not to watch the news and trying to keep up with what's happening. So until now, I had difficulty in one of those points in my life at the time, either home or work or wider systems, but never colliding in quite that way. And I think we need to recognise that as leaders, of the stresses and the pressures and that puts and how it makes it so much more difficult, that we were working in an operating environment that shifted so much at micro and macro level. The things that mattered most were fundamentally different: staying safe, keeping distant, being flexible, prepared to change again. And at a macro level, the way the country worked, from funding furlough for so long, imposing restriction on individuals, every sector from education to health to hospitality has been disrupted in a way we couldn't have imagined 18 months ago. So given that all-consuming impact of COVID on every aspect of our lives simultaneously, we need to alert to respond to, and to be an integral part of the wider system which we operate in, as well as managing our own operations and functions. And so to leadership then, what did we learn? What can we take away? And I've got 7 areas of challenge that I want to point to consider and think about, and sort of just have a slight mull over. The first one is act small, think big. So the challenges that we faced were huge. As local community organisations, we were on the front line trying to translate the intelligence and information we were gathering to feed it into the bigger system. And the old adage of eat an elephant one bite at a time definitely came in for me. I saw people who were frozen into inactivity. They couldn't take the first step or ask what can we do, rather than just seeing the impossibility and difficulties. And that applied at all levels. It applied locally, it applied at system level, and it applied nationally. And there's something about being strongest working together, but having little time to develop connections and relationships. And even small connections like picking up the phone, going to one network download meeting were really important small actions, which I saw time and time again lead to bigger things. And that being part of a system as well as an organisation led to much better problem solving. The second challenge is around being true to the values and the mission of the organisation. And I found that I needed a guiding light. I needed a framework that I could turn to help make decisions about what to do and where to focus. There was so much that was unknown and uncertain that we went back to our core values and missions as an organisation. What are we here for? And then using that to guide where we could have greatest impact. And that was really important and proved invaluable as we found our way through ongoing challenges from lockdown to reopening to furlough to reconfiguring services, balancing risk and needs and the needs of different people. At system level, that's more difficult because values can be glossed over or not placed at the heart of a system where there's multiple organisations involved. But I think they do go right to the core of why and how we work together. And ultimately, they enable people to put organisational self-interest to one side, which is key to effective systems thinking. And perhaps one of the biggest learning points around systems rather than organisational leadership, of that sense of organisational self-interest being set aside. But this is also the place where I'd add that we need to make sure we're working with all the communities that we need to be. And again, that point about seldom heard voices, they're not seldom heard or hard to reach. It's about making sure we're listening, working with, building trust with all the communities locally. And COVID has highlighted where charities and the BCS haven't done that or haven't done it well enough, especially around communities and people of colour. If part of our mission is about equality, particularly what we're doing to be anti-racist, is it enough as an organisation and as a system that we're a constructive disruptor? We need to make sure we're building trust, we're working with all the communities on our patch, and we keep on doing that. And the diversity points around diversity of leadership and how we work with all bits of the community feels really important and goes back to those values and mission. My third point is around organisation versus system leadership. I deliberately call it versus rather than and, as that is how it can feel, going back to the point about organisational self-interest. So through COVID, local organisations were being asked to step up in a way we haven't seen before. They're always recognised, their information intelligence was sought after. It was great. We had the opportunity to influence the big decisions in the system, to work with the city as it responded to COVID rather than being put to one side as the voluntary sector. But that came at a price because small charities don't have a corporate centre, let alone a big corporate centre with strategy leads and policy support who can take on that legwork. So the drain on the rest of the organisation was significant. So from my point of view, I was contributing to Gold Command, to Tactical Command, the BCS Emergency Partnership. It all felt really important to influence the system-wide stuff. And that role had to come through, but it did come at a cost to an organisation which was also trying to find its way to work with its new operating model, so remotely, online. Its budget for the year had been decimated because commercial income had dropped, and looking at future years with uncertainty around furlough and government support, future financial sustainability also felt quite difficult and quite shaky. So the balance between leadership within the organisation and leadership within the system need to do both, but getting the balance between them felt really tricky. My fourth one is around fail fast and fail early, which is perhaps a bit negative. And again, it speaks to what Gamil was talking about. But inevitably, perhaps that's my negativism, it's impossible to get everything right first time. And almost if you don't get things wrong sometimes, perhaps you're not trying hard enough or pushing the boundaries far enough, perhaps it's a bit too comfortable. And that's true in normal times, but even more so in a fast-moving environment in a global pandemic. And it's better to find out sooner than later it's the wrong track, to adjust, than to carry on regardless. But it's also better to try it and see if it's the right thing to do than to be too cautious. It's the ability to stand back and to learn and to adapt, which seems crucial to me. If it isn't this working this way, we need to know when to keep on trying, not giving up too soon, and when to try something else. And one important thing about failing is not to blame. I like to think I give others credit for successes and take responsibility myself when things fail. Because unless we do that, it's so much harder to learn from mistakes and give people permission to try new things. Unless we try new things, we won't get it right. Unless we do learn from mistakes, we'll keep on repeating them. So the ability to fail and to learn is really important. My fifth one is around looking after people. So one of the things I love about my job is talking to people, figuring out what's going on for them in their lives, where the tricky points are in the organisation, connecting people together. And that is so much harder when people are dispersed. You don't find out someone's having a hard time because you can see it on their face, so you talk to them in a tea point. And it's at that time when people felt isolated from the organisation and very much alone, are trying to find out how to do their job in new ways when they lost the connection and that interface and the ability to have a quick chat. So we relied a lot on line management structures, with some teams having a weekly drop-in, talking about non-work issues. Some had a touch point meeting a couple of times a week. Like many other organisations, we set up a whole plethora of communication channels in the giddiness of the first few months of lockdown, so WhatsApp groups and Trello boards and Jam boards. We had staff huddles, we flipped between Zoom and Teams, and we had meetings on specific issues just to engage people to bring them in. But we also knew that none of that was enough. It was never going to be enough. We had to do more, because unless you look after the people, they can't do their job. And that's what we need as an organisation and as a system at all levels. And linked to that,
3 minutes, Maddy.
Part of looking after people is about recognising where the knowledge and intelligence lies. And I haven't got all the answers, I never will have. It's important not to have one perspective or one dominant way of thinking, but again, bring people together, find ways to do that through the pandemic to solve the problem. My sixth one, looking after yourself. I said earlier on, it's been the most stressful time of my career. And one of the things that I learned absolutely was that I couldn't shoulder all the stress. That was a flawed strategy. I had to show my weaknesses to give other people permission to show theirs and find outlets for my stress that were safe and appropriate. I cried on my share, I showed my frustration to my senior managers, and people around knew that I was finding it tough. But I hope that those outlets both meant I could carry on and be a good leader, and that it freed other people up to also show their weakness and get support where they needed it. And my last one is around looking after the money, which is a bit like the system versus organisation point, that at several stages I felt I was too focused beyond our organisation and wasn't doing enough to be internally focused. Our income had been significantly cut, the budget for the year was no longer relevant, and we needed to make sure we were financially stable beyond 21-22. We had to make some really big decisions, we had to be quite brave in that, and again went back to our missions and values to help drive it. So several of those challenges and approaches fall back on things that were already in place, and I guess for me highlight the importance of good management and leadership. Because we've reviewed and focused on our strategy and mission, we could use that to guide us. Because I knew people, I could pick up the phone and connect to the person rather than the role or the function. Because we'd invested heavily in the culture about empowerment, people knew where they could make decisions and crack on and where they needed to pick up the phone and talk to somebody else. So I guess the final bit is about sort of the system leadership rather than organisation. And from what I've said, you'll realise, I think I would argue that it's both. And that unless individual organisation and system are robust, the system won't be strong. And leaders need to have a clear and collective sense of purpose and mission to drive it forward. As local VCS leaders, we've got responsibility to our organisations and the VCS to make sure it's resilient, it's focused, it's strong. But we also have a responsibility within the sector, within the system, particularly as we come out of COVID, to make sure that we bring the relationships, the intelligence, the different perspectives to bear as the system develops itself. So we sit alongside the local authority, the universities, the hospitals, the private sector to rebuild in the best way that we can. And that's really hard because that's stepping into a space where the balance of power isn't equal. And we sit alongside commissioners and funders, people who've got significantly more resource and impact than we have. But we need to do that and come to it with humility and understanding, to put aside previous relationships and assume that everyone's coming to it with good intent. So that's a whole pile of challenges that we face going forward: how to rebuild community resilience, how to support children and young people to recover, how to develop our economies. But I really think that the system-wide leadership is the way we need to move forward together. I shall stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Maddy. It forced me to do the response on behalf of CVSL. So good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel Haslam, and I'm a lecturer at the Open University Business School and a member of CVSL as well. So massive thanks, Maddy, for giving us that overview. It touches on so many points, I think, that are really, really relevant to some of the earlier aspects that Steve and Camille were talking about. And I guess my response, I'm going to try and structure it in the same way that you structured it, and just relate it to some of the things that are coming up later this afternoon in our workshops, but also wider CVSL work that's ongoing at the moment. The first thing I should say is that I think actually you've sort of summarised almost perfectly there that the experience of being involved in collaborative responses to the current issues in relation to COVID, but also issues that we see more widely in collaboration as well, and lots of Steve's work, as I mentioned, has focused on that. So yes, so I want to pick up on a few things. Firstly, the issues you noted, and the sort of the dual challenges of both working locally and also regionally, nationally as well, on a larger scale. It's something, those sort of tensions, I think, are the classic voluntary sector tensions about, well, we want to work and have an impact as widely as we can, but we also want to really concentrate on supporting our individual service users or clients or people or members or people engaged with our services. So that's a real tension, and I think that relates to some of the work that Carol actually referenced earlier about the Lloyds Foundation work that CVSL have been involved in terms of the value of small and really focusing on small and also medium-sized organisations, but also groups, community groups, self-help groups, etc., that aren't in organisational forms. So I think that's a really important point, because, as you mentioned, Maddy, it relates to the shared experiences at local levels. The values and missions as well, yeah, a really interesting one in relation to that, because we had a question earlier in the chat, I noticed, about whether leadership in the voluntary sector is different in some way to leadership in other areas. And very often this sort of thing we see in academia, and actually a lot that you get from practitioners, is that, well, yes, it's different because of the values and the mission, the specific social missions that organisations have. So maybe that's food for thought for people with the panel and in the workshops this afternoon. We also saw in the chat as well, and in your presentation, Maddy, about failing fast and having the space to be able to fail. And one of the things we emphasise a lot in CVSL courses is in our free courses that Carol mentioned at the start, is we need to be reflective, what we call reflexivity in academia, to be able to not just fail, but actually reflect on what that failure meant and why it happened and what you can take forward, etc. So that's really a key skill that we emphasise in that, and I encourage people to look at our courses if they want to follow that up. But really good point there. Finally, I just wanted to touch on one of the things that was throughout what you said, Maddy, about how a lot of these experiences that we have in organisations, in our working lives, in our personal lives, in communities, etc., really create, and certainly have over the last 12 months or so, additional areas of stress or increased areas of stress, overlapping aspects of stress, and how, as people in more senior positions in organisations, that creates a responsibility to try and look after people within your organisations, and how that's been a massive focus. But also on the flip side, the need to look after yourself as well, and all of our needs to look after ourselves, and often looking after your people and looking after yourself can be in tension. And some of those colliding issues that we see, those stressful issues are things that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, and that's creates ethical debates. And ethics is one of the workshops we're going to be looking at this afternoon with colleagues connected to CVSL. Including Dr. Nick Winchester. So yeah, it's another aspect that if people are interested in that, I'd encourage you to go along to that workshop. So lots of overlapping issues there, and I think one of the aspects of being reflective and encouraging challenge and failure and all those kinds of issues is having a knowledge that sometimes we're not going to get the perfect answer. We're trying to work our way through some of these things, and that's a challenge. But we do our best, and we try and communicate with each other and get to a good outcome. And then really quickly, just to finish off from me, the age-old challenge of looking after the money and the challenge of funding that's become even more of an issue in some ways over the last 12 months. But actually, we've also seen a willingness to fund new things that weren't funded before, or certainly things that over the last 10 years of austerity have been rowed back on. So yeah, big challenge in organisations, and but also I think some opportunities there to move forwards.